My parents mocked me and said, "On your brother's wedding day, it's better if you're not there." That was the moment I realized my own family saw me as nothing. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I'm Lena, 26, and I've always been the quiet one in my family. I wasn't the loud, charismatic type like my younger brother Caleb, who is 24. He was always the golden child, showered with praise, gifts, and endless patience. Me. I was just there, a shadow in my own home, tolerated but never truly loved. It wasn't a single moment that broke me. It was years of being overlooked. When Caleb got a car for his 16th birthday, I was handed a bus schedule and told to learn responsibility. When I worked double shifts to help pay for my textbooks, my parents laughed and said, "Well, Lena's always been the practical one." When I brought home straight A's, they'd shrug. But if Caleb passed a class by the skin of his teeth, it was cause for celebration. Still, a part of me hoped that one day they'd see me, that maybe my hard work, my quiet loyalty would mean something. That hope finally died the night of Caleb's wedding announcement dinner. We were all seated around the table, Caleb beaming, Marissa by his side. Everyone was laughing, clinking glasses, making toasts. And then my mom, Helen, looked at me with that smirk I know too well. "Lena, don't worry about buying a dress for the wedding," she said. "It's better if you're not there. You just embarrass us." The table erupted in laughter. Even Caleb chuckled under his breath. My dad, Ray, added, "Yeah, we want this day to be perfect. We can't risk awkward moments." I felt my face burn, every word slicing deeper than the last. I tried to swallow it, tried to keep my hands steady around the glass of water in front of me. But inside something shifted. I realized I'd spent my whole life waiting for their approval, for a kind word, for the bare minimum of respect. And in that moment I knew it was never coming. I excused myself early, went home, and sat in silence for hours. The humiliation still rang in my ears, but beneath it, there was something else: clarity. They didn't see me as family. They never had. And if they didn't want me at the wedding, fine. I wouldn't be there. But I also wouldn't be invisible anymore. I had worked hard to build a life for myself, something they never cared enough to notice. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their acceptance. I needed to stop letting their cruelty define me. That night, the betrayal burned hot. But under the ashes, a new resolve began to take shape. If they thought they could laugh at me forever, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Growing up, it was always clear who mattered more in our house. Caleb walked around in brand new sneakers while I wore hand-me-downs that never quite fit. When he wanted something, Mom and Dad found a way to provide. When I needed help, the answer was always, "Figure it out yourself." So I did. I picked up shifts after school, stacked shelves, and saved every dollar just to cover what they wouldn't. College only made the gap wider. They covered Caleb's tuition without hesitation, bragging about how bright his future was. Meanwhile, I juggled classes with late-night jobs, exhausted but determined not to fall behind. I remember finishing an essay at 3 a.m. with sore hands, then hearing them cheer the next morning because Caleb had managed to pass a single class he'd nearly failed. Their pride in him felt like a knife, each word reminding me that my own accomplishments meant nothing in their eyes. It was in the small moments too, the ones that cut the deepest. On one birthday, the cake arrived covered in candles, frosting bright and cheerful. But when I looked closely, my heart sank. Only Caleb's name was written across it, bold and perfect. No space for mine. No acknowledgement that I was part of the celebration. Everyone laughed, saying it was a mix-up, but the truth was written right there in sugar. I didn't count. These weren't isolated incidents. They built on each other year after year, until I stopped expecting fairness. Still, no matter how hard I tried to pretend it didn't matter, the sting never really faded. It was a reminder that I was born into a family where love had conditions, and I never seemed to meet them. That history sat heavy on my shoulders, shaping the way I saw myself and the people who were supposed to care for me most. By the time the wedding exclusion came, it wasn't shocking. It was simply the latest chapter in a long, cruel story. And deep down, I knew it had been written long before that night at the dinner table. Marissa was soft-spoken and polite when we met, the kind of person who smiled with her eyes but kept an arm's length between herself and the family chaos. She didn't look like someone who enjoyed drama. She looked like someone who had learned to step around it. That distance was quiet at first. Little pauses, neutral responses when Mom launched into a story about Caleb's childhood. Over time, though, I saw how her politeness shifted into caution. She mirrored their tone, laughed on cue, and rarely challenged a comment that landed like a slap. A week after the engagement announcement, my parents called me into the living room like it was an interrogation. They arranged themselves on the sofa, practiced calm expressions, and spoke in clipped sentences as if reading from a script. "We've thought about this carefully," my mother said, tone syrupy but precise. "For the ceremony, it's better if you don't attend. You know how family photos are. Some people can complicate things." My father nodded like a man confirming a verdict. They framed it as concern for appearances, as protection for everyone's comfort, but the undertone was unmistakable. Exclusion. I left without replying, but on the porch I lingered where the night air bit and the house lights felt too bright. Then I heard them in the kitchen, voices low but sharp with amusement. "Imagine her showing up in something tacky," my dad snorted. "She'd totally ruin the album." My mother chimed in with a cackle that sounded practiced. They traded cheap jokes like currency, and every punchline landed on me. That laughter lodged in my ribs. It wasn't just cruel. It was rehearsed performance by two people who had perfected the art of belittling. Standing there under the halo of the porch light, I felt the familiar ache of being measured and found wanting. The sting wasn't new. It had a name I knew well. But this time, instead of collapsing inward, I catalogued it. Every word, every sneer, every calculated pause, filed away like evidence. So I made a silent choice. If their idea of me was a spectacle they could laugh at, then I would oblige them on my own terms. I would not march into their narrative as the embarrassed figure they expected. I would transform their mocking prophecy into something they never imagined, a consequence born from their own decisions. I walked back inside, not to beg or to argue, but to begin setting the pieces in motion with a steady, deliberate calm. I would let their choices unravel while keeping my dignity intact. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind sharper than it had felt in years. There was no screaming, no tears, no frantic plotting. Just a steady current of thought. If they wanted me erased from their perfect picture, then fine, I could vanish. But disappearing didn't mean being powerless. I had something they never bothered to notice. A life of my own. Every morning I walked into a glass tower downtown, badge in hand, where I handled contracts and negotiations as a paralegal for one of the most respected firms in the city. My desk sat near partners who knew my name, who trusted me with details worth millions. My paycheck paid for an apartment that was mine alone. Walls lined with books and shelves I bought with my own money. Not charity, not favors, just the result of effort they never believed in. I had never flaunted any of this. Any time I mentioned even the smallest success, the response was the same. A scoff, a jab, a reminder that it wasn't worth celebrating. So I stopped talking. I let them assume I was struggling, unimportant, barely scraping by. They fed on that illusion, and I let them because correcting it only invited fresh insults. But now, silence didn't feel like protection anymore. Felt like armor. They had painted me invisible, and I realized I could use that invisibility to move freely, to act without suspicion. Their arrogance left them blind, and I intended to let them stumble into the pit they had dug with their own hands. No fireworks, no loud declarations. Just precision. I didn't need to shout that I had worth. I only needed to step aside and let their cruelty rebound. For once, I wasn't going to shield them from the consequences. I wasn't going to cushion the fall. As I closed my eyes, a calm settled over me. The revenge I imagined wasn't about spectacle. It was about exposure. They had built their lives on appearances, on a facade of control and superiority. All I had to do was stop protecting that image. They would collapse under the weight of their own pretense, and I would be there, not as the broken daughter they laughed at, but as the quiet witness who finally chose not to look away. I didn't have to dig far before the cracks showed. A few overheard conversations, a glance at envelopes stacked carelessly on the counter when I stopped by, and the truth began to take shape. Final notices tucked into drawers, credit cards stretched to their limits, a mortgage behind on payments. My father's latest venture, the one he had bragged about for years, had collapsed quietly, leaving nothing but debt and silence in its place. And still, they poured money into the wedding like it was a bottomless well. Designer flowers, a ballroom venue, live music. All on bills they couldn't possibly cover. Caleb strutted around as if he were royalty, rattling off demands without once considering who would pay for them. To him, extravagance wasn't a burden. It was his birthright. He assumed his parents would shoulder everything, just as they always had. But this time there was no cushion. The only hope left was family, and I knew exactly who they would turn to. Uncle Dean, my father's older brother, cautious with money but loyal to blood. He was the type to step in during a storm, even if it meant stretching himself thin. He had always treated me differently, not with favoritism but with respect, asking about my work, listening when I spoke. Out of everyone, he was the one who believed I could stand on my own. I could almost hear the plan forming in my parents' minds. Persuade Dean, tug at his sense of duty, remind him of appearances. They wouldn't hesitate to spin a story, casting themselves as victims of bad luck, glossing over their years of indulgence. They'd never mention how they mocked me, or how Caleb drained them dry. That was when I made a choice. I wouldn't confront them directly. I wouldn't shout about fairness or expose my life as proof of independence. Instead, I would be a quiet presence in Dean's ear, not to manipulate, but to ensure he saw the truth clearly. If they were counting on him to rescue their charade, then it was my responsibility to guide him away from the trap. I didn't need to block them outright. I only needed to hold up a mirror and let their reflection speak for itself. Their desperation, their entitlement, their reckless spending, it was all evidence. And with Dean's trust in me, I could be certain those signs wouldn't be ignored. For the first time, I felt like the silence I'd lived in for years could be transformed into power. They had written me off as irrelevant. They had no idea how wrong they were. I arranged to meet Uncle Dean at a small diner he liked, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the booths felt private enough for heavy conversations. He greeted me with that steady warmth he'd always shown, the kind that made me feel seen in a way my own parents never managed. When he asked how I'd been, I didn't brush it off like usual. I laid it out piece by piece, the years of being dismissed, the way Caleb was elevated above me no matter what, the cruel words at the dinner table when they told me not to show up to the wedding. I kept my voice calm, but I didn't soften the details. For once, I spoke without fear of being interrupted or laughed at. Dean's expression tightened with every word. By the time I described overhearing their jokes about me ruining their perfect photographs, his hands were clenched on the table. He didn't interrupt, just listened with a focus that made the silence between us feel heavy. When I finished, he shook his head slowly, disbelief etched across his face. "They think I'm going to help them," he said finally, his voice low but sharp. "After treating you like that, not a chance." He leaned forward, the firmness in his tone leaving no room for doubt. "They've made their choices, and I won't bankroll their cruelty. If they expect me to bail them out, they're in for a rude awakening." Relief washed over me, not because I wanted vengeance handed to me, but because someone outside of myself finally acknowledged the truth. For once, the weight of proving I wasn't imagining things lifted. Dean saw it for what it was. Ugliness disguised as family loyalty. We talked a while longer, not about plans or schemes, but about the years I'd spent trying to endure quietly. He told me I didn't owe them anything, and hearing that from him was like exhaling after holding my breath for years. When I finally walked out of the diner, the air felt different, lighter. My parents were still convinced money would arrive. that their usual safety net would catch them. They had no idea that lifeline had already been cut. As I slid into my car, a quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was the first real taste of justice, and it was enough to steady me for what was coming next. The morning of the wedding, I stayed home. No dress, no makeup, no rush to get anywhere. They had made it clear I wasn't wanted, so I gave them exactly that. But while my apartment was quiet, across town their perfect day was already unraveling. The first crack came with the food. The caterer, tired of chasing overdue checks, pulled out at the last minute. No elegant trays, no champagne towers, just empty tables where the spread should have been. Guests arrived expecting a feast and were greeted with awkward apologies and frantic scrambling. Then came the venue. The manager refused to unlock the main hall without full payment. My parents, red-faced and flustered, begged for more time, but policy was policy. With no funds to cover the balance, they were shoved into a smaller side room, one meant for conferences rather than celebrations. The grand vision they had sold to everyone shrank into something cramped and unimpressive. Marissa's relatives noticed immediately. Whispers moved through their side of the room, quiet at first but gaining volume as the missing details piled up. Where were the flowers they had promised? The band? The cocktail service? Questions shifted from disappointment to doubt, and eyes began turning toward Caleb with suspicion. I imagined him bristling under the scrutiny, offering excuses that only made him look less capable. He had always leaned on appearances, on the belief that someone else would clean up behind him. Now there was no one left to fix the mess. As the ceremony limped forward, the atmosphere soured. Guests murmured, trading looks that carried both amusement and pity. Every delay, every mistake became fuel for gossip that would spread long after the last toast. My parents, who had spent years preening about reputation, now stood in the center of a storm of humiliation. And me. I didn't need to witness it in person. I could already see it play out clearly in my mind. The chaos, the embarrassment, the cracks in their carefully built facade. They wanted me invisible, and so I was. But in my absence, the spotlight turned on them, brighter and harsher than they ever expected. The days after the disaster were filled with fallout my parents couldn't contain. Word spread quickly through Marissa's relatives. How bills had been ignored, how contracts were signed without money to back them, how the entire fiasco was built on false promises. What had been framed as bad luck was exposed as recklessness. The embarrassment wasn't confined to one ruined evening. It became the talk of the community, and the shame clung to them like smoke. I expected silence from Caleb, but instead my phone lit up late one night. His voice was sharp, frantic, laced with anger that had nowhere else to go. He accused me of sabotaging everything, of poisoning Uncle Dean against them, of letting the wedding fall apart when I could have stepped up. I listened, let the rage spill out, and when he paused for breath, I answered evenly. You told me not to be there. I wasn't. Everything else. That's on you. The line went quiet, and for the first time he had nothing to throw back. Not long after, my parents reached out. Their tone was different this time. Not mocking, not dismissive, but pleading. They spoke of family, of responsibility, of how much they needed me. They asked for help smoothing things over, for money, for anything that might repair the damage. But all I could hear were their voices from that night, laughing about how I would ruin their perfect pictures. I reminded them of their own words, delivered with the same calm they once mistook for weakness. You didn't want me standing beside you. You made that clear. Now you get to live with what you created. I didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't argue. I simply closed the door they had left open only when they needed saving. For the first time, the weight of betrayal shifted. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. It sat heavy on their shoulders, and they were the ones who had to reckon with it. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how light my days felt without the constant pull of their judgment. For the first time, I wasn't measuring myself against their approval or chasing scraps of affection. My time was mine, and I poured it into work, into quiet mornings with coffee, into evenings with people who valued me without conditions. Uncle Dean became a steady presence, checking in often, not out of pity but out of genuine care. We'd meet for lunch, swap stories, and he'd remind me that I'd done the right thing by protecting myself. Through him, I began to believe I wasn't defined by their cruelty. A few close friends filled the rest of my circle, people who cheered for me in ways my family never had. Their support was simple but powerful, laughter that wasn't at my expense, encouragement without strings. Meanwhile, Caleb's new life was unraveling almost as soon as it began. The financial hole left by the wedding grew deeper, and the tension seeped into his marriage. Marissa's patience thinned under the weight of unpaid bills and whispers about that disastrous day. What was supposed to mark the start of their future together had instead stained it, and the cracks were too obvious to ignore. My parents, once so eager to showcase their pride, found themselves shunned. The same neighbors who used to nod approvingly now kept their distance. Invitations stopped coming, conversations cut short when they entered a room. Their names carried embarrassment instead of prestige, and the community they had always sought to impress quietly turned its back. I watched all of it unfold without stepping in, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Their downfall wasn't mine to orchestrate. It was the natural result of years of arrogance and neglect. My role was simply to stop cushioning their falls. And in doing so, I discovered something I'd been missing all along: strength that didn't depend on anyone else. Each step forward was lighter, freer, as if the chains they had placed on me had finally rusted away. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I was just me, whole, steady, and untangled from their cruelty. Months later, they showed up unannounced, worn down and desperate. Their voices no longer carried the sharp edge of superiority. Instead, every word dripped with need. They spoke of second chances, of rebuilding, of how much easier things would be if I stepped in. The guilt they tried to stir felt familiar, but it no longer reached me. I listened, steady and unmoved, before answering. "You made it clear I wasn't family. Finally believe you. And I'm done." My words landed softly, without anger, but the silence that followed was heavier than any argument. They stared at me as if I had slammed a door they never thought I could close. I didn't linger. I walked away knowing the revenge was already complete. It hadn't come from shouting, from spectacle, or from schemes. It had come from stepping back and letting their own cruelty hollow out the life they had built. And while they drowned in the wreckage of their choices, I walked forward lighter than ever. Free, independent, and finally at peace. Do you think I was right to finally walk away from them, or should I have given them one more chance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like mine, subscribe.